Okay. Um, so I'm going to say some of the same things that Barbara has said, but I don't mind saying that because this is my sales pitch. I'm the person in ECC Library who supports archiving of data, data management plans, who I'm the person to come to when you have those difficult questions about qualitative research data and the sensitivity of it, or the licensing and copyright issues you might face if you're using third-party materials. So and I'm fine with reiterating because I've spent several years trying to drive this message home, and I still haven't hit all of the UCC community with this. So bear with me. Open research data. Now this is a tricky kind of one to pin down sometimes as to what exactly is open research data and why you as humanities researchers are being asked to engage in it. But if we take it as a more kind of broader view, and we'll build that into it in a minute, the reasons are very top down at the moment. It's largely funder driven. So it's coming from Horizon Europe, it's coming from IRC, it's coming from SRFI, HRB, some of the societies, whoever you're funded by, they generally have a data policy now, which is asking you to engage with open research data, and then maybe not mandating that you're going to have an open data set at the end of your project, but you're at least going to consider the question at the start of the project and throughout. And the reasons why, that we usually cite when asked why exactly we're being asked to engage in this, it's about transparency, accountability, reproducibility, the ability to build on existing data sets, revisiting existing data, and also we've seen there's advantages in terms of the reach of your research if you can make the data available. But also it's in the context that we are publicly funded researchers, so there's better value for public money spent on research. But open data doesn't actually tell you an awful lot about how you actually share a data set. It just tells you it should be out there, and that's where the FAIR principles come in. And the FAIR principles actually do themselves a little bit of a disservice in that they were written by computer scientists. So they focus an awful lot on jargon and things like machine readability, open linked data, which it may not be particularly familiar to a lot of our research community. But I think they also serve us very well because they have this caveat, as open as possible, but as closed as necessary. And for the type of data that you were talking about, qualitative research data, for data with any inherent sensitivity, that as open as possible, as closed as necessary caveat is really important, because that's how we can think about making things available, but protecting our participants and protecting the sensitive data we're working with as researchers. But FAIR is an acronym, and it's findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. The idea being that if you achieve the first three, you should get the third one for free. And reusable is sometimes substituted as reproducible or replicable. And that can make it kind of contentious, especially within the arts and humanities, because, you know, if you're doing a qualitative or an observational study, how exactly do you make that reproducible? But what we can think about is maybe focus more on the reusability of the data and focus more on the replicability of our methods and our studies. So we're adapting FAIR within the discipline, okay? The first three, findable, accessible, and interoperable, there are steps that you need to take there at the beginning of your research project. You need to build this in from the start, and this is something that Barbara said as well. You need a data management plan before you start collecting data that is thinking about these questions. A data management plan is broader than FAIR and open data. It's a really great way to improve the quality of your own research data, to help you with your research process, but for FAIR, having a data management plan that considers it from the start is really important. And why would you share your research data? What are the benefits for you? You can see that a lot of these are kind of external factors. So it's the basis of any publication. So it's benefiting outward. It's difficult or expensive to collect. Again, it's benefiting the funders and the wider community. It creates opportunities for collaboration. Well, actually, no, that's a bit more personal. That's benefiting you as a researcher, you know, widening the scope of your context and your network. There's more work to be done. This is one that is sometimes actually sent to me or said to me when I do these talks and when I sit with researchers as a reason as to why you wouldn't share your research data. But what I would suggest is that actually we're all very time poor. And if your funded part of your project is finished, if you're moving on to your next project, or you have a heavy teaching load for the next 12 months, is it likely that you, as the individual, will do the more work? And then the data sits in your bottom drawer for 12 months gathering dust, benefiting nobody. Whereas if you make it available as a fair data set, maybe you can invite collaborations with somebody who does currently have capacity and get a citation for it or get a new project from it. It could be linked with other data that's already published to make a new resource. This is hard to prove, but and hard to evidence, but the more better quality data that we are producing and the better quality metadata that we're producing with this and the better infrastructures we have to support FAIR, this will become more and more likely. And also, there is evidence that even having the intention to share research data means that you're paying more attention to it from the beginning. You're thinking about a third party has to read this. Somebody outside of my project group is going to look at this data. So you're improving the quality of your data from the beginning. And like I've been doing this for quite a while, advocating for fair and open data sharing. I've heard of all of the reasons as to why you wouldn't share your research data. And when we do this talk with students, we actually have an exercise where it's like, come up with as many reasons as you can why you wouldn't share your research data. And generally they can all come up with at least 20 good, bad, and ugly reasons as to why you wouldn't. But I think these are the ones that we come across the most. I don't recognize my research. This is not designed for me. I'm not sure about the data. And I think that term data can be very off-putting. It's not maybe a term that's used very much within arts and humanities. But we need to break that down and think about what are the objects, what are the assets, what are we working on. Arts and humanities research and data are very diverse. This is true. This is very true. This is why sharing data for arts and humanities and applying the FAIR principles for arts and humanities is much trickier in many of the other disciplines because it comes in multiple different formats and sizes and origins and provenances. There's copyright, there's licensing issues. But that isn't a reason why we shouldn't share it. It's a reason why we need to pay it more attention and think about it. But it also suggests that if we can have an ecosystem of fair and open data sharing, we're going to get a multitude of outputs, a really brilliant, diverse range of outputs that are very valuable. Ownership, licensing, and copyright, third-party materials. This is quite tricky. When you're working with particular archives and how do we work with third-party materials and align what the terms and conditions that those archives or the collection places on them with our commitments to fair and open data sharing. And in a lot of cases, it's about looking at the materials you're working on and going, I'm not sharing this. And that's okay to say that, but you need to be articulate why. And it's because it belongs to another collection. This is not my data. I don't own it. I'm using it temporarily for research. But then there are downstream outputs that you can consider sharing. Maybe you're developing a particular protocol. Maybe you have a search strategy that's gathering these materials. That all accounts for transparency and accountability. But also they're great learning tools for anybody else who's going to follow in this path and wants to replicate your study in another context. I need training in who can help me with my data. That's me. I can help you. I can maybe don't have the immediate answers to the questions, but I am tapped into a wide network of data stewards internationally and nationally within Ireland. And if I don't have the answer, and if you ask me the question, I will go and help you find the answer. And it might be, we will come back to the point where it's like, well, fair and open data sharing isn't for this project, but we're going to articulate that really well within your data management plan and in your reporting back to your funders so that they can, because the funders are also learning about this. They're still adjusting their policies based on what's coming back from researchers. And this is all in this context, a wider context. So fair and open data sharing is part of open research more broadly. And it's in this context of cultural change and a cultural shift. So we published the National Open Research Action Plan just a couple of years ago in Ireland. And it is kind of, again, top down. And it's bringing kind of this ethos of openness to our research community and our research practices. But that's not in isolation. We can't all just become experts in open research overnight. There has to be a whole ecosystem around it. Incentives is particularly tricky. We're not yet rewarded as researchers for engaging in open research practices. And there is a time cost to engaging in open research practices. Our communities are yet still developing around open research, especially within disciplines. There needs to be more within discipline discourse around how fair and open data applies. User experience and interfaces and infrastructure, we're still building the infrastructure. It's not yet all in place. We have data journals coming online, but there's very few of them, as we just saw. There isn't specific ones for everything. There isn't specific data repositories for everything. We don't have a data repository within UCC currently for UCC research data. So we're kind of trying to bring about this cultural change while still backfilling the infrastructure and everything behind it. So it is a bit messy at the moment. And I think the message there is stick with us. We're working on this. There are initiatives to work on this, and there are opportunities for you to get involved in those initiatives to change and to adapt to your own particular area of research. What is humanities data? I think Barbara covered this very well, but I like this definition. It's from the ALIA working group on humanities, and I've linked to it there in the slides. Think of all of your research assets as research data that could be potentially reused by other scholars. Consider how useful it would be for your own work to be shared if others shared their data. And I also would add to that, think of your data as a love letter to your future self, because just because you've shared it in an open data repository and allowed others to use it doesn't mean that you can't revisit it. And I'll tell you an example from my own personal experience. I finished my PhD in 2016, and at the time, nobody ever said do a data management plan or share the data as a fair data set or make it available or document it really well. If I went back to it at this point, it would be like it was written in another language. There's no way I could reuse it. But if I had considered, maybe not fair, but if I'd considered the documentation and the potential for future reuse, then I would be able to revisit it. I would be able to understand it, but that ship has sailed. So, just because you're making it available as fair and open data doesn't mean that you can't also be a reuser of that data. So I'm going to hurry up there. Where are we going to share data? In digital repositories, trustworthy digital repositories. The reason why we recommend digital repositories or data repositories is because they're specifically set up to do this job, to preserve what we're sharing. An Omeka site, as James talked about, is very tricky. It takes time and effort to continue to maintain that Omeka site. There's a cost ongoing with it. And actually, I've seen examples within our humanities where these amazing Omeka sites die very, very quickly after a project is finished or a researcher moves on or the postdoc leaves the project with the password and nobody knows how to gain access to it anymore. So using trustworthy digital repositories is really where you want to do your preservation. And if you think of those repositories as the preservation layer, and it doesn't mean that you can't have a beautiful exhibition or a Omeka site or WordPress site for dissemination while the project is live. There's lots of, I'm just going to point out a couple of links. So in terms of finding a data repository, we have some discipline-specific ones. Retree Data is a good database to find them, fairsharing.org, and Open Door. But also talk to your local experts and have a look where your peers are sharing their data. That's always a really good option as well. If somebody shared a data set and you think, geez, that's great, they've done a really good job there, copy what they did and use their data repository if it's available, because that's obviously where your peers are going, and it's a good mantra to follow. There's also kind of more generic or multidisciplinary repositories such as DANS, Zenodo, and Figshare, which are really useful. They're free to use. And sometimes when you're writing your data management plan at the application stage, those are the ones to put in, and you'll figure out the details later once you're funded. But it's figuring out those details is important. We also have access to the Digital Repository of Ireland. If you want to use it, come talk to me and send me an email, and I can set you up with an account. The DRI is largely for cultural heritage materials, but they are expanding and looking at taking more formal research data sets. It's a really great resource because We can interact with the staff in the DRI. They can provide you with advice and training and consultation. So it's a really great resource. And I'm going to finish up with this slide. How do you do this? Like, what are the steps? These are the steps. Describe what you have. What are the assets? What are you creating? And you would be surprised at how difficult some people find this, because you're not thinking of each individual object. But I would suggest think of each individual digital object that you are working with and describe it within your data management plan, and think early about this. You need to think early about these things. The other one is consider consent for fair sharing when applying for ethics. That catches an awful lot of people. If that ship has sailed, that ship has sailed, and you're done. So when you're applying for ethics, also your data management plan is a living document. Do revisit it. It's not something that you write once and never see again. And also budget time for archiving your data. At the end of a project, you need to allow time. It takes more time than you might imagine, even if you've planned from it from your start. And then disseminate the availability by writing a data paper. So I'll stop there. I probably have run over time. But for questions, I suppose, contact me on researchdata@UCC, pop them in the chat, and I will answer them. And our LibGuide is up there if you want to find out any more about our services.